So that's some of what the WRN has done. But one of the other things it did, and I'm so grateful, is that they put together this 4-part curriculum for this year. This is the Journey to 50. In 2022, it will be 50 years since Rabbi Sally Priesand was ordained, the first woman ordained from a mainstream seminary anywhere. And it's certainly something to celebrate. I forgot to put on, I do have my Journey to 50 pin. I guess I could wear that for the 4th week when I don't have the t-shirt, right? The Journey to 50 pin, and coincidentally, that is kind of, I feel like I should be wearing that every day through till next July, because I was born in 1972. So it's kind of mind-blowing to me that Sally Priesand was ordained the year that I was born. So this really is the Journey to 50 is what the WRN has been calling this. So what we're going to do tonight is actually go back in time. We're not just going to look at the experience of Reform rabbis in this country and the women. You might think that we would be starting this course with Sally, but we're not starting this course with Sally. We're starting actually quite a few hundred years before her, because to really understand or to think about what it means for women to be rabbis, to have the role of rabbi, to serve as rabbis in communities, to be accepted as rabbis in communities, to think about what is it specifically about women's lives and experiences that we just automatically bring to our work because of innately who we are and the world we grow up in and what it means to be a woman growing up, in this world. How does that shape the rabbinate? How have we impacted the rabbinate? In order to really think about that, we can go back even further to think about who are some of the women who led at a time where they didn't get the title, but they have remarkable stories, and they were perhaps rabbis in everything other than title. And I know that I learned about a couple of women in the prep for this program that I didn't know very much about. I may have heard their names, but I knew nothing really very much about them. And it's really exciting to be able to introduce you to them this evening. So I'm going to go to PowerPoint here. Okay, we'll be able to see that. Just so you know, those of you who are on Zoom, I now cannot see all of you at all. So if there's something you want to ask, please just unmute yourself. That's the best way to do it. So this is our Journey to 50, the history of women rabbis. And you'll see the title of the course is Scouts, Trailblazers, Pathfinders, Explorers. And those are the 4 parts. So we're going to be today looking at the Scouts, the ones who go ahead of everybody else, the Trailblazers, the firsts, and there we're going to be learning about more than just Sally Priesand. The Pathfinders are the first generation, the early group, and that 3rd session, that's when Rabbi Haken will be joining us, because she was one of them. Rabbi Haken was ordained in 1980. All of the women who were ordained in the first 10 years after Sally's ordination, we refer to within the Women's Rabbinic Network as the Vatikot. They are wise women, and we have gleaned and learned a lot from the experiences that they had and how that helped us develop the things that we needed to address and kind of move forward in our roles as rabbis. They kind of laid the groundwork that made my experience so much easier and vastly different to some of theirs. So Debbie was among them, and this congregation was really quite remarkable in not only hiring her as their senior rabbi, as their founding rabbi, but I think compared to some of her colleagues, the experience here was overwhelmingly a very positive one. She loved this community, and so we have a very unusual history in this congregation, in contrast to the experience of many women in the rabbinate around the country. And then the explorers will kind of look at some of the issues that we have address some of the kinds of experiences that women who came later, in the 90s and in the 2000s, what have they contributed to our movement, to Jewish ideas, to Jewish learning, to how we are in the community. So that's going to be the final session. Okay. So here's the first exercise. Those of you who are on Zoom, I'm going to invite you to take a moment to just scribble this down on a piece of paper. For those of you here, the sheet's there, and the sheet's over here, and a couple of pens here. Hang on a second. Just randomly pull out some. There we go. There we go. Thank you. Okay. So if you want to, on the top of your sheet, I'd like to invite you to think of a woman that you know, someone who you can think of that you consider to be a leader, to have made a mark. It doesn't have to be a famous person. It could be somebody you know in your local community or in a particular, line of work, profession. It's somebody who, in your mind, has been a significant leader in something, who is a woman. And think about, and it could be now, or it could be, from your childhood or from, decades ago. Think about what is it about their personal characteristics that sets them, in your mind, as having positive leadership qualities. Like what is it about their personal characteristics that enabled them to step into leadership as a woman? Second box, external advantages. And this might be, where they live, the kind of community they're part of, the kind of field they're in, who they knew, who they're connected to, what family they came from. Are there any, and there may not be, but are there any external advantages that enabled them to step into leadership in a particular way, in a particular environment, or in a particular moment in time? Are there any unusual circumstances that led to them stepping into that position of leadership? And once you've had a chance to just think about those things, underneath, are there any obstacles that you might think that they had faced, particularly someone you know, things that they had to deal with, that people, made assumptions about them or made things difficult for them, or there was a point where they couldn't go any further in terms of, being a leader, that they got so far, but then somehow they couldn't get beyond. What were those obstacles? So just take a couple of minutes, see if somebody comes to mind. And likewise on Zoom, if you can do that, what I'm going to do is I'll bring down the screen share in a minute. And when we have a moment to share some of this, I'm going to put those of you in Zoom into a few breakout groups. Okay, so I hope that was a useful way of just, we're a big group, we could introduce everyone to everyone, but I hope you got to meet a few people and just start to get thinking about this, because these questions that I asked about, sort of the characteristics, the circumstances, external factors, obstacles, I want you to kind of be just dwelling on what you sort of reviewed in the particular person that might have come to mind and what you heard and shared as we look at these three particular women that I'm going to introduce you to tonight. So I'm going to jump straight to it. The first woman that we're going to hear about is a woman called Oznat Barzani. Oznat Barzani. Has anybody heard that name before? Anybody who's on Zoom? Just raise a hand. Is it a familiar name? Don't see any hands. Okay, anyone here? Okay, fantastic. I didn't know anything about her either. I'm going to play just a very, very brief video of a woman who has written a children's book about Oznat Barzani. It's just the briefest of introductions, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about her. Really quite an amazing story.
Hi everyone, I'm Seagal Samuel. I'm the author of Oznat and Her Dove, the true story of the world's first female rabbi. When I was younger, I had a secret dream of becoming a rabbi, but I almost never saw a Jewish leader who was a woman, and even when I did, she never really looked like me or my family. My family comes from Iraq. You can see what they looked like in this old photo I've got of them. So it was a revelation to me the day I learned about a Kurdish girl named Oznat Barzani. She became a rabbi way back in the 1600s. I honestly didn't even know that was possible. But she was this brilliant scholar and poet and the leader of a school, and she also had a reputation for healing others. Here you can see her saving a congregation from a giant fire. I wanted to write her story so young readers today can know about her and her amazing achievements, and also so they can know that they can become leaders too, no matter what they look like or where they come from.
Okay, folks, was that better on Zoom? Those of you on Zoom, you could hear that? Yep? Good, okay. It's a little quiet in here, though. Let's just see if we can figure that out. There is if one of you with better sight than me right now is able to see where the volume plus button is on that, I think we can bump it up on this L. There's like two little square buttons, and one of them is a plus to raise the volume, but I can't see that at the moment. Okay, while they're looking at that, so let me tell you, remarkable. I mean, she wasn't officially ever ordained or given the title rabbi, but from Kurdistan. I mean, this is for those of us who come from Ashkenazi, Eastern European background. You know, we, I think, have probably carried with us a certain European elitism that we kind of just assume that we were at the forefront of things. There you go. Thank you. Thank you for that to the max. That we were at the forefront of things, and actually we see that sometimes some of the most forward-thinking communities lie in other parts of the world that we are all woefully ignorant of unless we are part of those communities, like this young woman whose family was from Iraq, who investigated this and wrote the book. So let me tell you just a little bit more about Oznat. Because we got a very brief piece of who she was, where she lived, and a couple of stories, but I'm going to share a little bit more, and then would love to get sort of questions or sort of responses as you think about, how this woman managed to do what she did. Okay, so first of all, she was the daughter of an eminent rabbi, one of the leading rabbis of Kurdistan, Rabbi Shmuel Nathaniel Alevi. We think he was born approximately 1560, and we don't know exactly when he died. We've got dates sort of 1625 to 1635. But that's what we're talking about. So remarkably early to be thinking about anyone who was a female leader, teacher in the Jewish world. So he had a very large following. He was a teacher, he was a scholar, he was also a mystic. And he built a yeshiva in Mosul. He wanted to train young men to become community leaders, to sort of have that group of leaders spread out and lead other communities. But he had no sons, and so he trained and taught his daughter. And that's how Oznat gets the learning she does. For those of you who have read the Rashi's Daughter series, very similar kind of background there. We don't have very much extant of her words, but there are a couple of primary sources that have been found that do exist. So in one letter where she describes her upbringing, and this little excerpt says, she said, "I never left the entrance to my house or went outside. I was like a princess of Israel. I grew up on the laps of scholars, anchored to my father of blessed memory. I was never taught any work but sacred study, to uphold, as it is said, and you shall recite it day and night." Now, among those who knew her and her scholarship, she was known as the Ta'anit, And that is quite an unusual title. It was used to describe the sages of the Mishnah. So that's how she was regarded by others who studied with her. So she ended up marrying one of her father's finest students, Rabbi Jacob Mizrahi. But again, very unusual circumstance. There were conditions to the marriage. Tanayim are the terms of the marriage that are made before people get married. And this is what we have again from a letter, an excerpt of these were the terms of the marriage. As he, my father, made my partner swear never to allow me to engage in work. By that we're talking about like housework. And thus he did as he was commanded. From the start, the Rabbi Mizrahi was involved in his studies and did not have time to teach the students, so I would teach them in his stead, a helpmate. So she was teaching the students in the yeshiva. After her father died, her husband would technically have become the head of the yeshiva, but it continues to basically be Oznat, who is the one who does most of the teaching and trains these young men to become rabbis in the community. Quite outstanding. And when her husband passes away, the leadership of the yeshiva passed to his widow, passed to her. She became the official leader. Now, unfortunately, neither her father nor her husband had been very good at fundraising for this yeshiva, and one of the things that she did not feel was appropriate for a woman was to go about trying to fundraise. And so there were times when they were in pretty dire straits, and she had her home, her belongings, her books confiscated because of debts that were owed by the yeshiva. But she continued to teach, and it's quite clear from letters that were addressed to her that her scholarship was held in very high esteem. So that's a little bit about her. I don't know if I have anything else particularly to add to that. Just another example. The community of Baghdad went to her and asked her to choose for them a rabbi out of her yeshiva students. So not only did she agree to say, okay, I'll send a good rabbi to you, but she was a little biased, she sent her son. But again, just an idea of the esteem. Now, what the other information we have about Oznat is contained in amulets. There's a lot of folk stories and mythology. Once she died, she becomes this sort of mythical person. And as is often the case with great rabbis or scholars or mystics, people will go pray at their grave, asking them to intercede for them. And so it's interesting that in this culture, her name comes up and pieces of stories about her come up in amulets. So in particular, we find amulets which allude to her supernatural powers. There's nothing we have any history about other than these amulets. They include her ability to limit her childbearing to 2 children so that she could devote herself to her studies. Apparently, that was part of her history. The ability to freeze an intruder in his tracks in order to prevent him from raping her, a feat achieved by loudly calling out holy names. And in this particular article I was reading about her, what they point out is ironically that in her life, while she was a teacher, it didn't appear that her sex really was an issue or came up. But in these kinds of mythical stories and these amulets, her sexuality becomes more of a feature of who she is and some of these stories about her. And then probably one of the best-known legends, which is what's featured in that children's book, is that she said that she received messages from her father in dreams. And one of these stories is that while she was visiting a Maiden on Rosh Chodesh, she convinced the community to celebrate outside. And the synagogue suddenly went up in flames. By means of a secret name, she alerted the angels of the danger, and they successfully extinguished the fire. The synagogue, its contents were unharmed, and they renamed the synagogue in Oznat's honor because of how she had saved the synagogue. We have no recorded information about there being any opposition to her leadership amongst this Kurdish community and beyond in that part of the world. But neither can we find any record of her influencing other women to follow in her footsteps. She did apparently have a daughter, and she did not follow in her footsteps. However, as people have gotten to know about her, her existence and her scholarship has been used in the Orthodox world to make the case for ordaining women as rabbis in the Orthodox world. And she's still known and idolized by the Kurdish Jewish community, where her name is there. I asked a community of people of Kurdish background, have you heard of Oznat? All of the hands would have gone up. They would all know who she was. She was a legend in that community. So let me just pause there. That's our incredible, formative women leader number one. What strikes you about what I've shared about her story in terms of the opportunities, the obstacles? How did this woman get to have this role back in the 1600s? And I'll look out for those of you in here, but please raise a hand on the screen, and I can take comments and all the fun that way as well. Yeah, Natalie, go ahead.
With the permission of the men who had leadership positions. Women in that time and until very recently still need the permission of men to assume leadership and power. Right, so she, needed, right, they could have opposed, they didn't, but right, the power still lay with them.
And both her husband or her father and then her husband agreed to and facilitated her rising to that position of power and leadership. In the Hasidic period, and this is a different story, again, quite remarkable in its own way.
Mysticism. Mysticism for the masses. Hasidism. The 18th century Hasidic movement. A rebirth, democratization of the Jewish spirit in the bosom of a crushed Eastern European Jewry demands a lot to be discussed by way of introduction. And perhaps we will make, God willing, we will make a separate video and even a series of videos covering, introducing, and discussing the Hasidic movement, not just because it's the mystical tradition which I myself was born into, but because it's an incredibly important one for the history of mysticism and Jewish mysticism in particular. But if there's one thing to know about the Hasidic movement, at least from a sociological standpoint, it is the innovative relationship between Rebbe and Chassid, master and disciple, leader and student, shepherd and flock, that becomes a defining feature of the movement. Now, being and belonging to a highly traditional society, all Hasidic Rabbis were men. That is, besides for one. Chana Rachel Webermacher was born in the Polish shtetl Ludmir around 1805 to Hasidic parents who were followers of the Hasidic masters Rabbi Mordechai Twersky, known as the Maggid of Chernobyl. Chana Rachel's father was also a wealthy businessman, and as such provided a top-class Jewish education for his daughter. When Chana Rachel was just 9 years old, her mother passed away, and in a transformative moment in her early teens, while visiting her mother's grave, Chana Rachel became extremely ill, during which she is reported to have had heavenly visions, in which she received a, quote, new and lofty soul. When she finally recovered from her illness, she was a truly transformed person, and began fulfilling the Jewish requirements that are obligatory only for men, and began to spend much time in meditation, study, and prayer. She soon acquired a reputation for being a scholar, miracle worker, and healer, and many sought her out for advice, blessing, and healing. And when her father died shortly later, she used the money which she received in her inheritance to build a beautiful synagogue and study hall of her own. As her fame grew, Chana Rachel began to assume the responsibilities, roles, and tasks reserved strictly for Hasidic rabbis, such as receiving private audiences, yichidut, and kvitzlach, prayer requests, presiding over a tish, the rabbinic table surrounded by one's chassidim, one's disciples, at which she would teach novel Torah teachings and pass out shirayim, leftovers from the Rebbe's meal, all traditional roles and rites performed strictly by the Rebbe, although many accounts say that she did so from behind some sort of partition out of modesty. Now, while other women, such as Malka of Trisk and Chana Rachel of Chernobyl, also acquired reputations for their sanctity and holiness, they were always relatives to powerful Hasidic men. By contrast, Chana Rachel, known as the Maiden of Ludmir, was born simply to a well-to-do family that was not part of any emerging Hasidic dynasty, making her sanctity and leadership something of an independent phenomenon, not relying on the religious status of other men in her family or husband. However, Chana Rachel, being the anomaly that she was receiving considerable opposition from the staunchly traditional Hasidic community, who were uneasy with her unusual practice. Unsure of what to do, Chana Rachel consulted with her father's Rebbe, the Margaret of Chernobyl. The Maggid requested that she discontinue her unusual behavior and requested that she get married. Chana Rachel abided and temporarily halted her activities as a Hasidic Rebbe and teacher, and got married, although it is unclear how long that marriage lasted. Later, probably around 1859, Chana Rachel emigrated to the land of Israel, settling in the Mei Sha'arim neighborhood of Jerusalem, where she attracted a small but diverse following of Jerusalemite women, may have even been include them a number of Muslim women, and gained their reputation as a Torah teacher and Kabbalist. On Shabbat mornings, she would walk to the Western Wall to pray, surrounded by a retinue of followers and those hoping to get her blessing. And on Shabbat afternoons, they would gather in her home to hear words of Torah. And famously, for the celebration of Simchat Torah, women would come from all over the country, as far as Hebron, Tiberia, and Tzfat, to enjoy the festivities and celebrations with her and to hear Torah from her lips. Chana Rachel, the Maiden of Ludmir, passed away on the 22nd of the Hebrew month of Tammuz, and was buried on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem, her burial place becoming a place of pilgrimage for her followers for many years to come. Despite, or perhaps because of, the lack of information that we have factually about her life, Chana Rachel has inspired a century of writers to tell and retell her story in theater and fiction, including Singer's novel Shoshan, and more recently Gershom Winkler's novel They Called Her Rebbe. For more scholarly works on this incredible character, check out these works.
Okay, so really an unusual circumstance to have a woman take on the role of a rabbi, essentially. So questions, responses, comments about her. I do have a little bit more information, but I'd like to sort of be guided by sort of, what's your sort of reactions to hearing this story, and how she managed to be and do what she did in such an incredibly hierarchical, patriarchal Hasidic community.
It's interesting that despite her behavior, everything that she had done up to that point in her life, when she was faced with opposition and she consulted her daughter's Rebbe, and the Rebbe said, "You're done, get married," she complied, which seemed very out of character with everything she'd done before.
Right. Were you able to hear that on Zoom? No, okay, not clearly. So let me just repeat. So what Sharon was saying is that when she there was this sort of beginning of some opposition or discomfort with what she was doing. When she consulted with her Rebbe or her father's Rebbe, and his recommendation was go get married, she complied. In the essays that I had about her life, it was a little different to what you said. Actually, apparently, it's claimed that she may never have consummated that marriage, that she got divorced very quickly. That there may have been another marriage possibly after that, but likewise didn't really last. And then she went off to Israel. Even though she may have maintained her image or reputation as a maid, as a virgin, so her wisdom sort of and her who she was sort of remained somewhat intact. Once she had been married, that was it. The kind of her role in this particular community was over. She was kind of able to reinvent herself again in Israel to some degree. And it's interesting because if you think about it in the Christian community, the idea of the woman who is remains pure, the virgin woman, and who has a channel for some special spirituality or ability to provide blessings or to have that kind of connection is a woman that's raised up in a lot of Christian context, but in the Jewish context, and especially in the Hasidic context, she's seen as an anathema to what the culture and the community is about, which is to have children and to run a household. And so she really was very much outside anything normative in the Hasidic world. Just looking up on the screen. Any comments, questions, reflections on sort of, how did she manage to do this for as long as she did? Yeah, Helene, go ahead.
Question. So her followers were men?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's really quite remarkable. Her followers appear to have been men, maybe some women as well, but certainly initially men. When she went to Israel, Palestine at that time, it sounds like she was primarily with women. But yes, initially, it sounds like it was certainly initially men. Very, very unusual. Yeah. Yeah, Cheryl.
It seems like in most of the women that we discussed, they did not have sons. As the fathers did not have sons to pass the knowledge on to, so they decided that it was good enough, they had to pass their knowledge on, so they accepted their daughters. And I guess through that, the daughters felt empowered to take on that knowledge that other women didn't have, and to really become a force.
Right. Right. Just to repeat, in case you didn't hear that clearly, Cheryl was noting that in both of these cases so far, these women, their fathers did not appear to have sons, and so they therefore educated these daughters. In this case, though while she didn't come from a Hasidic dynasty, her father was a well-to-do merchant and so could afford to give her an education, which, in most families, they either didn't have the money or didn't have the inclination to spend money in that kind of education. And what comes to mind as you say that is just thinking about how in the modern day, the terrible scenes that we have seen unfold in Afghanistan, right? The power that comes with education. That women were given an education. There are women who became judges in the last 20 years in Afghanistan who have now not only lost their jobs but are in hiding, scared for their lives under the Taliban. That is a society and a regime that sees the education of women as extremely threatening to their ability to control and to have power over the society. And so that is something that we see here, that these women who are given education use that education. It gives them a very different perspective on the world than the one they might have done if they were just trained to work in the home, to raise a family. Gordon, I think I saw your hand before.
I actually had a question. So in both of the stories that you relayed, there was one characteristic, and that was they had powers of healing. Is that something that all rabbis were known for, or is it specifically the women that were known for this?
That's a great question. No, not all rabbis were known for their powers of healing. Certainly, particularly in the mystical communities, and both of these, both in the Kurdish community that we were looking at and in the Hasidic community, these are communities that aren't just sort of rational scholars of text. They are also mystics working in the materials of Jewish mysticism, where there's a lot more of that. To be a powerful leader, one would be associated with the ability to write amulets of protection, or to dispel, an evil spirit that has entered your soul or your home, to usher out those evil spirits. And so, yeah, there certainly is an association. It's not uniquely because they're women. What I find really interesting in this particular woman's case is that, I don't think it's a stretch when you listen to her story to put a kind of a queer lens on this, which I'm going to do for a moment. I think she was a queer woman who had no desire to be with men in a conventional way at all. And that this story about how she came to have this knowledge and this leadership, which is that, he explained it a little bit, but actually the essay I have goes into a little bit more detail. She was quite distressed that she had been promised to a childhood playmate, and she withdrew from society. She wanted, she had, like at an early age, was told, this is going to be your future, your fate, and she wanted none of it, so she withdrew. And then her mother died suddenly, quite young, and at that point she becomes a recluse. And she doesn't go anywhere other than visiting her mother's grave at the cemetery. And during one of those visits, apparently she falls into unconsciousness, which is followed by a prolonged and mysterious illness, and when she recovers, it has been claimed that she's been given a new and elevated soul. And at that moment, she breaks off the engagement, declares that she will never marry, and she has transcended the world of the flesh. So it's a little different to the piece of the video that we saw. So I think that one of the reasons she was able to do what she did and had the respect of these men who followed her was because she was in a larger cultural context in which the idea that some great wise Rebbe, some other Chassid who had died, might have entered her as a soul and was using her as a vehicle to teach his wisdom would have been believable, would have been something, and I actually think she was very smart. I think she did this, I'm not a believer that this was a real thing that happened, but I think she was very smart to know this was her out. This was how she could live the one life she wanted, by basically, that we didn't have transgender people in those days, but she could basically take on the role of a man by claiming that she had been taken over by the soul of a Rebbe. And I think that, I'm theorizing, I'm just based on like reading between the lines of the story. I think that's what's going on here, and I think that might be why she was able to do what she did for so long. But at a certain point, people ask questions and they're getting a little uncomfortable, and hang on, she really is? This whole thing about the tish, this is a very strange thing in Hasidism, that at a tish, which is the third meal, that the Rebbe is served with food. And it is seen to be like you are literally receiving a piece of the Rebbe's kind of soul, the Rebbe's wisdom, when you get given the crumbs, the leftovers from the Rebbe's plate. It is quite a bizarre phenomenon, but it is a thing. And so the fact that she was at that level, that that's what she was doing, I think might have, some people eventually were going, but really she is a woman. Right? This is not her role, this is not her place. And so it's interesting to me that she ends up leaving, escaping. She never ends up being the conventional married woman, and she ends up finding people, women, both Jewish and Muslim, who gathered around her as a teacher in Mea Shearim in Palestine. So really, really fascinating character. And I'm kind of glad she's been rediscovered. Other thoughts or questions or reactions? Anybody wants to? of her thought. Sorry? Oh, okay, so Barbara and then Helene, go ahead.
Okay, I just, for some of you will remember, several years ago, we read the story of Enchant, Maggie Hansen, and the reason I'm mentioning it now is that took place around 200 AD in that area, and even then, there were women mystics who had healing powers and helped psychological counseling and fertility counseling and all kinds of things. And they were really the first women doctors
Right.
in this Jewish community. And that was very interesting. So I think she's very much following in that tradition, which she probably knew about.
Right.
So it was written down.
So for the benefit, again, in case it wasn't clear to hear on Zoom, so Bob was talking about a book that the book club read a few years ago, The Enchantress, which is set in the 200, where we're seeing the role of women as people who are involved in healing in particular, and maybe the sort of the early, what becomes the early days of medicine and doctors. And I think that role, I think, certainly there were women in the Hasidic throughout, these sort of folk remedies, that tradition as being something that women had was, I think, was carried through. And even then, I mean, that sort of in different communities at different moments in time, I'm not so aware of these stories in the Jewish world, but outside the Jewish world, what's the line between the sort of folk medicine and sort of the wisdom that women get from the experience of using natural items and seeing how they affect people and how they heal, and when that crosses over to accusations of witchcraft, right? And something sort of that's underhanded and dark, and we see that play out, in a bunch of different communities and cultures. So while women did have that role, it was confined. It was constrained. Helene, go ahead.
Just a quick comment. I was surprised, or I thought it was wonderful seeing the man respectfully and enthusiastically telling us about her. I don't know that I expected it to be a man. That's my comment.
When I send out a follow-up email, I will send you guys the links, because that was just a short piece of a much, much longer lecture about significant women leaders, in different moments in time. And I don't know much about him. I mean, he said he grew up in a Hasidic background. I don't know if he was Lubavitch or something else, but yes, he's clearly a very interesting teacher in his own right.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry that I didn't look him up to be able to tell you more about him, but I'll send you all the links that I've been using, so that if you want to investigate further, you can do that. Okay, we've got one more to get to tonight, and this one I think perhaps some of you may have heard of, because we're moving up to a more contemporary period, the late 1800s, early 1900s, and to the United States. Ray Frank. Who has heard of Ray Frank? I don't see hands in the room. Anyone on screen heard of Ray Frank? Okay, fantastic. I love it when we get to all learn new things. So I came across Ray Frank, actually. There's a wonderful book by, oh my goodness, is Suri there? She wants for a little bit. No. Ellen, it's not your cousin Ellen, Marsha. I don't know if Marsha's still here. She had to pop up as well. There's another, Ellen Umansky. Ellen Umansky, who's professor of Jewish studies at Fairfield University in Connecticut. Ellen Umansky, a number of years ago, back in the late 80s, I think, put together a compilation book called 4 Centuries of Jewish Women, or Jewish Women's Wisdom, or something like that. It is 4th century of Jewish women. And what it is it's all primary sources. And it's an amazing collection. It's one of the early sort of Jewish women's books that I picked up, just seeing it on a shelf in a library, in a bookstore, and buying it in the UK. And it opened up to me all of these people that I'd never heard of before, including Ray Frank. And we'll learn about what Ray Frank did, and then I'll tell you what the source is that's in that particular book. I think we have this book in our library. But anyway, let's go to this final video. So we may have a little ad to play first. There we go.
So Ray Frank was pretty much a contemporary of Anna Greenbaum Solomon, though her life was organized differently. She is known as the first woman to preach from a pulpit in the U.S., which happened in 1890. And her career was also a part of this conversation about expanding women's sphere, in her case in particular in terms of public ritual roles. Ray Frank was born in San Francisco to Polish immigrants who were Orthodox but open-minded. She grew up in Sacramento and then moved to Nevada to be a teacher during the time of the gold rush. There were very few Jews, so that experience really helped her be attuned to issues of prejudice and assimilation and how small Jewish communities could work to support one another. In 1885, she returned to her family in Oakland and began working as a journalist and also as a Hebrew school teacher. And both of those areas of work got her more involved in Jewish communal issues in her teaching and her writing. So in 1890, her reporting work took her to the Pacific Northwest in the fall, around the time of the high holidays, and she ended up in Spokane, Washington on the eve of Rosh Hashanah. And she was very upset when she got there to discover that although there was a Jewish community there, there were no services that were planned because the Orthodox and liberal Jews could not agree about how to hold the service together, and there weren't really enough people to hold two full services. And when she expressed this publicly, someone that she knew there offered to find a space for services and she would agree to give the sermon, which she did. And as you might imagine, this attracted quite a large crowd, not only of Jews, also of Christians who were just curious to hear a woman preach. And she gave a very powerful sermon that night about the need of Jews to overcome their differences and to work together to form community. And the community was so impressed with her words that they actually invited her to stay through Yom Kippur, and we'll point out at the end that we also have a Go and Learn lesson plan set based on her Yom Kippur sermon. So the news of her preaching spread and attracted quite a bit of attention, particularly because it happened during this time of rethinking women's roles, and headlines called her the Maiden in the Temple and the Jewess in the Pulpit and the Girl Rabbi of the Golden West. It was a time when there were changes happening in the synagogue and liberal synagogues, changes to family pews instead of separate seating. There were mixed-sex choirs, confirmation for girls was beginning at this time. And there was concern about what was called the feminization of the synagogue, the fact that more and more of the people who were coming to the synagogue were women, but there were still no official ritual roles for girls and women, so there was some tension around that, like all these women are here and what are they supposed to be doing? So this really launched Ray Frank on a new career in which she traveled around the country speaking publicly, giving sermons and lectures in synagogues and community groups on religious subjects, not necessarily on women's rights, but on issues having to do with the Jewish community. Frank insisted she was not interested in becoming a rabbi, despite the fact that people kept calling her, the girl rabbi, and despite the fact that she did register for some courses at Hebrew Union College. People didn't really believe her, and she was brought into these debates on whether women could be rabbis, although of course we know that it took quite a bit longer, not until 1972, when Sally Friesen was ordained, for there to be a woman rabbi in America. Frank herself actually held ambivalent and some contradictory positions on women's rights. Though she lectured widely about women in the synagogue, she said she didn't want to be a rabbi, that she thought it was a masculine role. She also did not support women's suffrage, and I think probably the most surprising opinion she held was that married women should not work outside of the home. She was single at the time of this career of public speaking, and in fact, after she married, she did not continue that kind of public work. Of course, that piece of her career was made possible by the fact that she married at age 40, so she had a chance to have this other career before her marriage. In the late 1890s, after nearly a decade of traveling around and speaking, she was quite exhausted. She went to Europe to relax, and she met Simon Whitman there, and they got married, and in 1902 they returned from Europe to California, and in fact, Ray Frank did not go back to her work. She helped her husband with his work. He was a professor. She was ready to back to Lake. They moved to Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, and she got very involved in local community work. especially in the Jewish community, and didn't go back to her public speaking roles particularly. So it's very interesting in that she proved that there are many different kinds of ways to support the Jewish community and to encourage Jewish conversations, and she felt strongly that there were some that were appropriate for women who were married and some that
So again, here's the list of Go and Learn activities. It's under the education menu here. And the last one is on Ray Frank's Yom Kippur sermon. And you'll notice that this is slightly different in that it has the 3 age-appropriate lesson plans here for middle school and high school, family education, and adults.
All right, there we go. Finding the right screen to put back up. There we go. Sorry?
Was that just me or was she talking really fast?
No. I'm sorry. Yeah, and it's interesting when we're trying to do this in 2 different spaces. What I heard on my computer when it wasn't coming through this was a lot clearer. You know, these guys are probably hearing it better than we are in this room. So that's one of the sort of little technical blips that we're sort of. We might find it was clearer in the recording, but she was talking very, very fast. That's for sure. So, reactions to Ray Frank. She's a mixed bag. I mean, on the one hand, there's this sort of excitement that, you know, this is the precursor. We're talking now America, you know, she's in front of people. Apparently that sermon she gave where the Orthodox and the Reform wouldn't get together, and so she said, well, you know, she got up and spoke. I think it was Yom Kippur. They had Jews and Christians. The estimate was that there were 1,000 people. They used the opera house to bring people together. That's where she gave a sermon. I mean, quite remarkable. But yet the full picture of who she was and her beliefs is quite complex. So what are your thoughts, reactions to what you learned about her? Elaine, go ahead.
I have a question. With the newspaper articles that were shown as she was talking, what kind of newspapers were in there that she was even heard of? That could have all been buried very easily, and yet obviously it was publicized. And I'm just curious how that was publicized.
Yeah, some of this was in Jewish press. You know, there was Jewish bulletins that would have served particular communities, but some of them were in local mainstream newspapers. I think it's a mix, if I remember correctly. And I think I'm trying to remember that in that 4 centuries of Jewish women that I mentioned by Umansky, one of those newspaper articles is in there, but I cannot remember where it was published. But it was a mix. Yeah. Other reactions? Thoughts to Ray Frank? If we come back and think to some of the things that we started the session with in terms of the leadership qualities, external opportunities, and the some of the other factors that we were looking at the very beginning, bring back some of that to how we're looking at the story so far that we know of Ray Frank. Sharon.
I don't understand why they were so quick to label her as Girl Rabbi, because she's not, it seems like she's not preaching so much as lecturing. She's doing the lecture circuit, which was a popular form of entertainment. She's not leading services. She's not teaching. So what gave her that label?
Yeah, that's an interesting. So Sharon's asking, what gave her the label of like the girl rabbi? She's giving lectures. She's talking about ways of trying to bring Jewish communities together, who are at odds with each other. But yeah, why rabbi? And there's nothing that we particularly heard in that excerpt, and I think actually in the excerpt of the Yom Kippur sermon, which is what's included in Ellen Umansky's collection, I don't recall there being like explicit Torah being taught in sort of the way that you might sort of expect sort of a rabbinic sermon to be structured in some way. Yeah, it's a good question. I think it was simply the fact that she was taking center stage in the context of a Jewish community gathering. It wasn't just a lecture night, it was sometimes in the context of a festival or a ritual gathering in which she wasn't leading the ritual, but she was getting up and giving the main speech. And so, right, in the context of a service gathering, the main speech is a sermon. So it was seen in that way. But it's a great question in terms of, which I think brings up another question, which in these last few minutes, I would love us to think about. You know, based on the 3 women we've learned about today, who were not actually rabbis, but perhaps could well have been, was such a thing an accepted norm in their time and their place, is what actually makes a rabbi a rabbi? You know, when we think about sort of qualities or leadership or skills, or like, what are some of the things that you would say is, if I see this list of things associated with this person, or I see them doing this kind of stuff, you know, is it just that I have like the job title, or is, you know, what makes a rabbi a rabbi? Because I think that's an interesting question for us as we think about why women could or could not be rabbis. You know, other than, you know, the wrong biological organs, you know, in particular moments in time, what is it that makes a rabbi? Susan, go ahead.
Yes, she died in 1948, and although she was very clear that she saw herself as a teacher, but not as a male role, do we have any evidence if anyone had come up to her during her life saying, I think a woman should be a rabbi, whether she was critical, whether her criteria were only for her or for any woman who wanted to pursue? Would she clamp down and say, that's not appropriate for you, or was it just for her?
That's a really great question. So I do have one thing that I can share with you. So it was mentioned very, very briefly in that very, very fast little lecture that she did enroll briefly at Hebrew Union College. So let me just read to you from this essay that I have, an excerpt about this. Right. She came to the attention of Reform rabbi and leader Isaac Mayer Wise, who at that time was the president of Hebrew Union College. And that actually he had founded the college a decade earlier in Cincinnati. She enrolled for what proved to be only one semester, and she told the press that her intention was to study Jewish philosophy and not to become a rabbi. But yet, less than 2 months earlier, in his journal, The American Israelite, Wise wrote the following: "We glory in her zeal and moral courage to break down the last remains of the barriers erected in the synagogue against women, and wish her the best of success." Subsequently, in February of 1893, the American Israelite identified Frank as the young lady who has gained much prestige on the Pacific coast and whose avowed purpose of entering the Jewish ministry has aroused much attention. So it's interesting. I mean, Susan, your question is right on point. And I don't know, I don't think any of us really truly know whether Isaac Mayer Wise, was he willing to ordain her if she had wanted to pursue that? If she had done what Sally Priesand did and actually put in writing, you know, this is my desire and intention, and entered into that conversation, would he have done that? I mean, there's at least an indication that he may have been very supportive of that path at a remarkably early moment in time. You know, we wouldn't have been waiting till 1972. And yet we have from other records the fact that she claimed to not desire it, that she didn't think it was appropriate for married women to pursue, you know, the kind of role that even she did. And she stopped pursuing that role and stopped giving those kinds of lectures and doing that kind of community leadership once she herself married. And the question is whether that was a truly strongly held belief that this was what women, you had a duty, this was what you were meant to do, whether it was a feeling that, you know, like some of us have had, you know, how do I do both? You know, I put my all into my journalism and my lecturing, now I'm going to put my all into raising a family, and as an individual, I can't seem to do both. But she does project that out as statements that she made to say, I don't think women in general should do those things. I don't know if you picked it up in the lecture, she was not a believer in women's suffrage. She did not support women's rights to vote. So she's quite an enigma. You know, she's a product of her time, but, you know, on the one hand, such an incredible, you know, story that exists in this moment in time, and on the other hand, you know, in some ways, she's very much a holder of the expectations and the traditions of that moment. Karen, go ahead.
So just to address that, I mean, we don't know, I didn't remember hearing anything about this woman, about Frank and her family, and how her family reacted to her. In the other two women, they had fathers in particular who were extremely supportive of them and who encouraged their education. And perhaps she was raised in a family that told her that this was, that they just let her know that this was the role that was expected of her and never saw her as anything else.
Thank you, Karen. I think that's a great insight. This is what I have actually about her early history. Her father was a peddler and fruit vendor. So you're right, very different station in life to the fathers in the other two stories that we heard. He had a wife, Leah, and Ray had two sisters, and they were raised in what she would describe later as a deeply religious home. Her mother was a quiet, pious woman who was fond of reading the Bible. Her father was an Orthodox Jew. He was the great-grandson of the renowned Gaon of Vilna. So they had yichus, they had some, you know, rabbinic. That's real yichus in the Jewish world, to have come to be the great-grandson of the Gaon of Vilna. But to your point, you're right, she grew up in a household where there were certain expectations. On the one hand, she certainly supersedes them, like, you know, having a career and being a journalist and traveling to the other side of the country. You know, there was a remarkable frontier spirit there in her. And yet, I mean, she doesn't marry till she's 40, but yet there is this traditional piece of her, that voice maybe from her childhood of her parents saying, this is what we expect, this is what you should be doing. And I suspect that many women, you know, grappled with that, you know, not just externally, but internally. You know, there's the outside obstacles, the expectations of society in terms of what a woman's role is and what the men in the society will permit in terms of what you can do and how far you can go. We saw that in the Maiden of Ludmir, for example. But there's also the internal narrative that many women carried with them and still do today. I mean, think about, you know, the stories of how many women have left the workforce since the pandemic, right? Why is it that overwhelmingly women have been the ones to leave the workforce in order to provide more support for the family and for the children at home? You know, it could be something as simple as the remaining inequalities in who earns what and how far they've gotten in the career path, but it's not only that. It's clearly not only that. And so there is still, you know, this expectation, this societal expectation that when additional presence and care is needed, that overwhelmingly, not in all, but in a larger proportion of cases, it's going to be the women in you know, let's say a heterosexual family situation who are going to step into that role. So we haven't left that behind. And so when we think about, you know, the women who came first, and women like Debbie Haken, and the women who have been rabbis since then, you know, they have continued to live with those tensions and fight those fights and deal with those internal and external battles. So that's going to be part of the story that we see as the story unfolds.